Good evening to our viewers in Poland, in Central Europe. Good afternoon to our friends on the other side of the pond, and to our dear guest, Professor Halina Goldberg. My name is Kajetan Prochyra. I'm the music curator at Polin, Museum of the History of Polish Jews, and I have this great pleasure and honor to moderate the first of academic events devoted to the brand new Legacy Gallery, an extension of Polin Museum's core exhibition that explores contribution of Polish Jews to the world civilization in the fields of arts, sciences, economics, education, and politics. This lecture is organized as a part of the Global Education Outreach Program that was made possible thanks to Toby Philanthropists, the William K. Bowes Jr. Foundation, and the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. And tonight, we're in for a treat. The presentation titled Shared Soundscapes, the Legacy of Polish Jews in Music, will be presented by Professor Halina Goldberg. Professor Halina Goldberg is a professor of music at the Jacobs School of Music and affiliate faculty at the Robert A. and Sandra S. Bourne's Jewish Studies program and the Russian and East European Studies Institute at Indiana University in Bloomington. She also serves as the project director for the Digital Scholarly Commons dedicated to the studies of Jewish life in pre-World War II, which Halina Goldberg's work is interdisciplinary, drawing on cultural studies, music, politics, performance practices, and reception. She focuses on the 19th and 20th century Poland and Eastern Europe, Chopin, and Jewish studies on the interconnection of Polish and Jewish cultures. The presentation is planned for about 45 to 60 minutes. You are more than welcome to post questions to Professor Goldberg in the comment section of our YouTube field. And finally, Madam Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Halina Goldberg.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction, Mr. Prochyra, and I appreciate your willingness to moderate this talk and to introduce me so graciously. I am delighted to be here. I am grateful to the Polin Global Education Outreach Program, specifically to Mrs. Joanna Wójcicka-Warda and Dr. Artur Markowski and Professor Kirschenblatt Gimlet for their invitation and for helping prepare this lecture. And I also want to thank the supporters of this program, Taube Philanthropies, William K. Bowes Foundation, and the Association of Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. I will move on to my PowerPoint. Let me see. In 1638, King Władysław IV, the ruler of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was entertained during a banquet given in his honor in Lwów by an orchestra consisting of Jewish musicians. Musicorum Synagoga Sinfoniaci de Tribu Juda, dressed in Turkish attire. The chronicler commented that the king, who was overall favorably disposed towards the Jews, reacted with delight and enjoyed himself well into the night while listening to music and dancing. Historical records in Poland are full of information of Jewish musical presence in Polish life, and Polish historians documented some of these instances. Here's another one in 1717, Elżbieta Sieniawska, the Grand Hetmaness of the Crown, who was a renowned patron of the arts. music in particular, visited her estate in Puławy. In the absence of her court orchestra, she was offered the services of Jewish musicians from Tarnogród. So when we scrutinize the annals of Polish history, we find mentions like this pertaining to Polish aristocracy, pertaining to Polish royalty, but we also find other records, for example, information about village musicians interacting with each other. There are repeated prohibitions on Jewish musicians taking part in particular musical activities. And as always, these kind of prohibitions testify to a practice that needs to be prohibited repeatedly. And then we also have records of exceptions to these prohibitions. These records go well into the 20th century. Some of the most beautiful records of these interactions come from a beautiful book by Andrzej Bieńkowski, Sprzedana Muzyka, the sold music or sold instruments. The word muzyka is being used in two senses by the musicians in here. And here is a band from Rawa Mazowiecka, a town not far from Warsaw, from 1930. And there are three musicians in this photograph. On the left, the violinist is a Jewish violinist, only known by his first name, Yudwy. His colleagues knew that he was killed by the Nazis, died in a ghetto, as they said, and then the other two musicians are Gentile. So this is a kind of a culture of musical exchange that is documented well into the period preceding the Holocaust. There are surprising places where we see collaborations. For example, we see collaborations in sacred spaces. Here's a record from 1703 of a confraternity serving the musicians of Vilna. That seems to suggest that it was open to Jews, despite the confraternity's Christian character. They were asked to pay a fee, and then they were allowed to play in weddings and even in church services. When progressive synagogues opened in Warsaw in the 19th century, there were Gentile organists who were playing the harmonium at the synagogue. And here you have names of two of them, Józef Jarocki and Fryderyk Loppe. They were playing in rehearsals. The harmonium did not accompany the choir during actual services, but the harmonium was used in rehearsals, and it was also used for non-liturgical occasions in synagogue, including weddings and funerals. So my talk today is going to concentrate on some aspect of Gentile Jewish interaction in Poland. First of all, I am going to speak mostly about the 19th century and kind of stop at the point of Poland regaining sovereignty at the end of World War II. And I'm sorry, I am trying to keep track of some information that I want to make sure that you can see me well here. So I will focus on the 19th century, and the interwar period is its own period. There's just so much that I would need a separate lecture just for that period, and maybe we'll do that at some point in the future. I will also limit myself mostly to the music of the progressive Jews. So art music, music of the progressive synagogues, their participation in institutions of musical learning, and so forth. And I am also going to focus mostly on Russian Poland, meaning the Polish kingdom, with a special focus on the city of Warsaw. Again, there is a whole chapter or more than one to be written about music in, let's say, Galicia in the 19th century. So given the restrictions of time, I'm going to kind of keep to a specific geographic area, specific time frame, and limit myself to discussion of just some aspects of music. There are a few terms that I want to just clarify. You probably know them, but they are central to this kind of interaction that I will be talking about. The first one is, of course, Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, which originated in Prussia and migrated to Poland actually very, very early when Warsaw was under Prussian occupation. A number of bureaucrats in the Prussian administration were proponents of the Haskalah, and they brought it in, as did merchants and students that traveled to Poland at the end of the 18th century. So actually the first progressive minyan in Poland starts meeting in 1800 in Warsaw, and not long after that they move to a synagogue space. Of course, Haskalah is a program of modification of Jewish modernization of Jewish religious practice and social life to facilitate social inclusion and full citizenship. And the Polish proponents of the Haskalah that set the tone in Warsaw in the 19th century were the integrationists who supported the integration of Jews into Polish statehood, the projected Polish state, the recovered Polish state, and the granting of full rights to Jews while maintaining Jewish religious practice. And a number of people that we will mention here actually are well-known integrationists who are also patrons of music. Music figures very, very centrally in the Haskalah because the concept of Bildung that was very, very closely associated with the Jewish Enlightenment, the idea of self-cultivation leading to intellectual, spiritual, and moral growth, betterment, was also including music as one of the tools of the self-cultivation. So with this in mind, I want to just outline a few areas of participation and interaction that I will talk about. Of course, I will talk about performance and composition, Jewish musicians who were well-known locally and internationally, and some of them were both performers and composers. Others were one or the other, especially later on in the 19th century. But I also want to talk about a whole group of other issues that have to do with cultural production of music, the industries that support music in the 19th century. This would be music printing, selling musical prints, some music bookstores. It is also the production of instruments, and again, shops in which one could buy musical instruments. It is the area of patronage in terms of organization of musical life, both in terms of private patronage, salons that would facilitate the production, the performance of music, the exploration of music for people who had particular interests, who wanted to hear music that would not be available in public. One example, Beethoven's chamber music that was not performed in public in Poland in the early 19th century, but you could hear it in musical salons at private concerts. And then public institutions such as Warsaw Music Society, about which I will talk more later. And here we talk about the organization of musical life. It has to do with concerts, it has to do with music societies, but also music conservatory, later on the establishment of Warsaw Philharmonics and so forth. Music as patriotic activity. There are many other areas. I will not talk about them today. Jewish involvement in the pedagogy of music, music scholarship, music journalism. But there is more to music than just performance and composition, and I want to shed light on some of those activities. And finally, I want to talk also about the shared musical languages, because I think we often have the assumption that music produced by Jewish musicians sounds Jewish. And I think while that is sometimes the case, while there is a kind of a marked and specifically idiomatic language that comes from Jewish folklore and from traditional synagogue chants, there was also an area of sharing of musical styles that I think will be very important, and I want to call your attention to that. So with this in mind, let's start with one of the first famous Jewish musicians of the 19th century, and that's Józef Guzikov. He was a performer at an instrument known as the straw xylophone. It was an ancestor of a modern xylophone. As you can see in this image, the instrument consisted of wooden blocks that would produce different pitch. And he became so famous that actually he had an extraordinary following in Western Europe. In Paris, he was so popular that his payas became an impetus for a new and very much very, very popular coiffure a la Guzikov that women wore in Paris throughout. Let's see how this then changes. Hold on one second. By the 1830s, several of the street musicians that were known in Warsaw started to play in cafe and garden ensembles. And very often these were Jewish ensembles consisting of members of one particular family. A number of these musicians were so acclaimed, so skilled, that they were invited to play in Warsaw's musical theaters. By the 1830s, the National Theater no longer existed. For political reasons, it was closed when it reopened. It opened simply as Teatr Wielki, the Grand Theater, removing the label National. And in the same space was shared by the variety theater, Teatr Rozmaitości, which played a lighter repertory of Singspiel and Liederspiel kind of operettas. And these musicians that I have listed here, Adam Sturm, Itzek Schultz, both played in the variety theater orchestras starting in the 1830s. And then Hirsch violoncellista, later known as Abraham Herman, was actually a cellist at the National Theater at the time, the Grand Theater. He also taught at the conservatory later on. Of all of the musicians that started their lives in this kind of folk-like kapelle, playing in gardens and streets of Warsaw, perhaps the most famous and the most successful was Isidor Lotto. He was a child of Warsaw street musicians, and the talent was noted immediately by the musical circles of Warsaw. Adam Sturm, whose name you just saw on the previous slide, was his first teacher. And then he was sponsored to study in Paris with Massart, who for a long time it was not known who the sponsor was. The sponsor was anonymous, but the obituary of Henryk Teplitz actually names him as the sponsor of Lotto. And we'll talk about Teplitz a little bit more in a moment. Let's listen a little bit to what Lotto's music was like, typical virtuoso repertory. So you can hear his spinning girl, which is, of course, an excuse to demonstrate moto perpetua virtuosity. The relationship between musicians and the patrons is, in a way, visible here on paper in this print, a mazur that was composed by Adam Sturm and is dedicated to Zofia Teplitz. Zofia Teplitz was the daughter of Theodor, sister of Henryk Teplitz, very prominent maskils, and members of the Warsaw Progressive Congregation, but also prominent public intellectuals and prominent presence in the progressive Jewish community. The most famous of musicians of Jewish descent in the first part of the 19th century was Maria Szymanowska. She was born in a Frankist family. She was born Maria Wołoska. Her husband, whose name was Szymanowski, was also a Frankist. And Szymanowska's marriage did not last very long. She had 3 children. By the time the 3rd child was born, she knew she no longer could stay in that marriage, but that put her in a position that a married woman would not necessarily be able to maintain. She returned to playing piano, and she played the piano before her marriage and traveled abroad and made extraordinary connections and played concerts. She started to do that again after her divorce. There was also necessity there. She needed to support herself and her children, and she was spotted by the Tsar and was invited to serve as the court pianist in St. Petersburg to Alexander I, and that's where she died during a cholera epidemics. I would like to play a mazurka by Szymanowska. mazurkas are a generation older than Chopin mazurkas, so they are among the compositions in this genre that became the model for Chopin. Chopin also was familiar with her playing. He mentions her performances in his letters. And she was an extraordinary performer, one who introduced into piano playing the beautiful legato style that we consider to be a hallmark of the Romantic playing, different than the kind of articulated style of her other contemporaries. And she also played the kind of robust English piano in Warsaw that Chopin thought was quite extraordinary. This was the kind of instrument that he later favored in form of the Erard and Pleyel pianos that were sort of descendants of the English piano of the 1820s. So Szymanowska was not only an extraordinary pianist and a terrific composer, but she was also a patron. Here is a lovely drawing from an album, one of the albums owned by Szymanowska, in which she had inscriptions by friends, poetry, music, drawings, documented her rich social life and the wonderful, fascinating people that she met throughout Europe. And you can imagine this kind of a salon entertainment. They are clearly in costumes in here that might have been some sort of tableau vivant inscenization of with musical accompaniment. And these kind of performances very often also took place in her St. Petersburg salon, where she also entertained Adam Mickiewicz, who was a close friend and later married her daughter. There were other patrons who had salons large and small. Here's one of the larger ones. This is Leopold Stanisław Cronenberg, banker and the father of a prominent banking industrialist family in Warsaw. This is a lovely lithograph by Maximilian Fayans, a Jewish lithographer. And he's a lithographer known also for portraits. So it's really quite extraordinary that you can recognize the faces of specific members of the progressive Jewish community. Cronenberg himself, by this point, converted to Christianity, but clearly maintained relationship with members of the Jewish community. And Adam Minheimer is conducting also a descendant of an important Jewish Warsaw family, is conducting an oratorio in the Ruzhin Palace. That's the older palace. The newer one, the Cronenberg Palace, was not yet built. This was somewhat earlier. The Wolf family, they were prominent in Warsaw already in the 1820s. All of the musical luminaries in Warsaw visited their salon. That was specifically a musical salon. Józef Wolf was a doctor. Eleonora had extensive musical training. She was a very good pianist, and we know that because there are actually some reviews of her performances in Warsaw in musical press. And Józef Elsner, who was the director of the Warsaw Opera House and important opera composer and composition teacher of Chopin's, was involved with the Wolf family very closely. Actually, as was Żywny, the first teacher, the first piano teacher of Chopin's. And Elsner dedicated a piano quartet in F major to Mrs. Wolf. So there were performances of chamber music that were happening there weekly. And it's very likely that Chopin visited the Wolf salon. the Wolfs had 5 children, and they were all in one way or another involved with music. Among their descendants, there are several professional musicians and several music patrons, all the way to great-grandchildren who were composers as well. But let me draw your attention to some of the most famous members of the Wolf family. Here's Edvard Wolf, who was 4 years younger than Chopin, and he followed Chopin after Chopin was in Paris a couple of years. He actually got a letter from Żywny recommending Wolf to him, and when Wolf arrived in Paris, he established himself as one of the most prominent musicians there. You can see him here on this image in the company of the celebrated pianists, as the caption for this image says, and you will recognize Chopin sitting right in the center, and Liszt sitting on the right, and Wolf is sitting on the left. He became a professor at the Parisian Conservatory, and quite a prominent presence in the pianistic world of Paris. One of the Wolf children cultivated music privately, and their 2 sons, her 2 sons, became very well-known musicians. You probably know the name of Henryk Wieniawski, who was one of the most prominent violin virtuosi of his generation. Fewer people know about Józef Wieniawski, who was a pianist. You can see their image when they were still teenagers on the right. On the left, you see a poster of their concert in Lviv, and both of them continued to teach and perform throughout their lives. Wieniawski spent much of his life in Warsaw and became very, very prominent in the organization of musical life in Warsaw as well. We will return to that in a moment. Let me play some music by Józef Wieniawski. This is his piano concerto in G minor, composed in 1859. Józef Wieniawski was very active in the Warsaw Music Society. You see him here among the founders of the society in 1871. This was an institution that was crucial to sustaining musical life in Warsaw. it is responsible for the revival of the Warsaw Conservatory. It reopened as the Music Institute, and it is responsible for the establishment of the Philharmonics. It has helped establish the Chopin competition. It also supported some prominent, important musicians, composers of that generation, including Moniuszko, who was very much involved with the workings of the Warsaw Music Society. There were other Jewish musicians and music patrons among the founders of the Warsaw Music Society. So here I have again Teplitz, Ludwig Grossman, Adam Minheimer, and Wieniawski, whom you saw already. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about Ludwig Grossman, who was an interesting person. And I will start by contextualizing him within the kind of patriotic music making that composers and performers engaged in the 19th century, supporting political efforts, supporting military effort, and so forth. So let me give you some examples of this kind of music making. Here is, for example, a march dedicated to General Jan Skrzynecki during the November uprising, composed by Edward Wolf. Here is another publication, really, really interesting publication. The text here is written by Synaj Hernisz, or Stanisław Hernisz, who this is a person who deserves a movie to be made about him. He was a student at the Warsaw Rabbinical School and then fought in the November uprising, then ended up leaving Poland, spent some time in China. He ended up in the United States and served in a diplomatic mission to China. He, I think, wrote first Chinese English dictionary, published in the United States, really an extraordinarily interesting man. So what he did is he took a song, well-known drinking song by Chopin, Szynkareczko, szafareczko, busie boga stój, and redid it as a patriotic song, rewrote it with a text that is, hej Polaku, hej rodaku, uchwyć oręż dłoń, słodkie blizny dla ojczyzny, za Moskalem goń. So this is a patriotic text that is encouraging participation in the uprising. It was published probably shortly after 1831, outside of Warsaw. And here's a piece by Grossman that has a patriotic purpose. This is, again, has a beautiful, beautiful lithograph by Fajans that kind of immediately captures the title Polish Rhapsody, and it shows scenes, pictures of Poland that in not so subtle way go beyond just pastoral imagery, but also suggest, especially if you look at the top of that image, there is a grave and the cross suggests the patriotic sacrifice and so forth. This was published in 1961. So this is the period leading to the January uprising. Shortly after that, the two rabbis of the two progressive synagogues were arrested and forbidden from performing their function. So shortly after that, a complete silencing of any kind of patriotic manifestation takes place. But this was still possible to publish something like this, although the actual patriotic meaning of it comes in the tunes that are not labeled in the song. For those of you who know the songs, the tunes that I have listed here, the Dąbrowski Mazurka is a patriotic tune, a contender to Polish national Polish national anthem, and it becomes a Polish national anthem in the 20th century. God Save Poland, a religious hymn that also was a contender to Polish national anthem. It is still an important patriotic song till today. Let me play some excerpts from the Rhapsody, and you can hear these tunes, how they are woven into a narrative and virtuoso pianistic idiom. Chłopicki Mazur. So Grossman was a composer. He worked on behalf of organizations of musical life, especially the Warsaw Music Society. He also had a piano salon, a shop with pianos in Warsaw. So he was a very prominent figure in various aspects of Polish musical life. The most successful of his work was the opera, The Ghost of Voivod, and this is a cartoon published in 1877 in the satirical journal Mucha, The Fly, where you have the Warsaw critics on the left before he traveled to Vienna, and then after his success in Vienna, he is towering over them. There are still arias and excerpts from that opera that actually remain in the repertory. So I hope that what you are also hearing in these excerpts that I'm playing, that unless I would tell you that these are compositions by Jewish composers, you probably wouldn't know. The musical idiom, the style of music is mainstream European style of music, no different than virtuoso works by Gentile composers, no different than patriotic works by Gentile composers. Of course, here is an opera that has, again, nothing to do with Jewishness. It's a typical operetta style idiom that you find in the Ghost of the Voivode. Interestingly enough, you will find these kind of connections in synagogue music as well. And I want to give you some examples of what was going on in Warsaw Progressive Synagogues. There were two progressive synagogues that basically merged when the building on Tłomackie was built in the 70s. One was the Polish synagogue that was initially affiliated with the School of Rabbis, and then the German synagogue that after one generation remained German in name only. It was the descendants of those German families were essentially Polish Jews and acting as such in terms of their patriotic activities, engagement with community, language, and so forth. Here you have names of some of the musicians who were working in the synagogues that also studied music at the conservatory, studied singing with prominent musicians who taught at the conservatory. And some of them, such as Fischl Weishoff, continued to perform secular repertory even when he was the cantor and choir director at the Polish synagogue. He continued to perform concerts. The music that was performed in the synagogue by the choir, and as I mentioned earlier, for liturgical purposes, the choir played a cappella during rehearsal, and on other occasions it would perform with a harmonium. The music that was performed in the progressive synagogues was very typically European music. It borrowed the language mostly of Lutheran choral music. There is a similarity to some of the music that, for example, Mendelssohn wrote for communal performances or less skilled choruses during the 40s in Berlin for choruses. Maybe you will hear some also of Brahms style writing, but it's fairly simple. The idea was to have not very skilled choruses also be able to enjoy it. So here is Leopold Weiss, who was a cantor and music director of the so-called German synagogue. Here is the title page of the collection of music that he published in 1881. There's an earlier volume that he published in the 70s. And here's an excerpt from one of the Psalms. The Psalms, the music is usually in two languages. There is Hebrew and German. The other two languages are Russian and Polish. So each piece gives options of two languages. This is a piece that is using a Polish translation of Psalms by Franciszek Karpiński. That was a beautiful poetic translation that was standard at the time. And I will let you hear a little bit of Psalm written for the Warsaw Synagogue. Sing, of singing was also used in other progressive synagogues. Here is an example from Częstochowa synagogue by the composer who was very strongly affiliated with that synagogue, Abraham Ber Birnbaum. And here is an excerpt from his Lechododi from the late 19th century as it would have been performed in the Progressive Synagogue of Częstochowa. With the rise of new political cultural trends in the late 19th, early 20th century, you start getting compositions that very deliberately incorporate Jewish folk music. These are composers with folkist or Zionist sympathies who are looking for inspiration to Jewish folklore. And I want to play an example of that from a piece by Juliusz Bolfson. So he was a conservatory trained composer, studied with Zygmunt Noskowski, perhaps the most prominent composer of his generation in Warsaw, and Aleksander Michałowski, who was one of the greatest pianists of his generation as well, student of Mikuli, who was a student of Chopin. And Wolfson starts to compose works with clear Jewish flavor. So you will hear a song that we all know and love. This is a song that goes under many titles. Sometimes we hear it under the title Majufes. Sometimes we will hear it as the Rebbe Hot Geheißen Freilichsein, but it's a tune that you will recognize, but also you will hear the virtuoso pianist in it. The figurations on the piano are clearly somebody who was a master of the virtuosic pianistic idiom of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And the harmonies are actually quite typical of what we would hear in the compositions of this period. So enjoy this. end of the 19th century, music societies organized specifically by Jews with the idea of promoting Jewish music, bringing in Jewish audiences, spring up all over Polish lands. They are in big cities such as in Łódź, Warsaw, and Lwów and Krakow, but they are also found in smaller cities. And I want to end with some music that is associated with music societies in my own hometown of Łódź. Here is the Hazomir Choir, established in Łódź in 1899. The first director was Józef Rumszyński. Yes, this is the Rumszyński who later left for New York and became known here as foremost Jewish operetta composer. And then two other musicians, Zabel Zilbert, who also ended up in New York, and Israel Fajvyshys, who stayed in Poland. I want to talk a little bit about Zilbert and Fajvyshys and let you hear some music. Zilbert was educated in Warsaw Conservatory. This is actually his picture as a student at the conservatory. And while he was the director of the Hazomir Choir in Łódź, they developed a collaboration with the Łódź Symphony Orchestra, which was formed during World War I, basically to provide employment for musicians who were out of work at the time. And they undertook a monumental project of preparing Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. You see here, if you follow the arrows, the name of Zilbert as the person who prepared the choir, the Hazomir Choir. But the conductor of this performance was Bronisław Schulz. I direct you back to 1 hour ago, the Jacek Schulz, who established this clan of musicians, actually performed all over the place. There was one Bronisław, who was actually there was not Bronisław, but another Schulz who played the Boston Symphony. So into the 1950s. So this was a sprawling musical family, and the other performer, the other director of the Hazomir was Israel Fajvyshys, who stayed in Poland, and as you can see here, was killed in the Holocaust. Fajvyshys is present in music throughout Poland. He was active in Lwów for a while. He then moved to Łódź and worked there for a number of years. He ended up in a Warsaw ghetto where he directed the children's choir. And this is a beautiful, beautiful arrangement of a folk song by Fajvyshys, which was composed while he was the director of Hazomir in Łódź. And while the song, Her Dushein Meidele, is probably familiar to many of you, he is setting it up in, again, kind of a European choral tradition, perhaps like folk settings of settings of folk songs by Brahms. So I invite you to enjoy this excerpt, and I will let Fajvyshys have the last word. Thank you.
Madam Professor, thank you so much for this presentation. Ruth, I think we've all have learned a lot, and I encourage all our viewers to type down questions in the comment sections or in the question section on our YouTube feed. We already have a couple of questions, starting with comments such as the one from Mary Samulewski. She expressed her gratitude. Thank you for this amazing lecture. I can truly say I have learned something new. The music excerpts you played are beautiful. So that was more of a general comment. And on the other hand, a very specific question from Sylwia Jakubczyk-Ślęczka. Do you know if Weiss's psalm was performed also in Polish in Warsaw Progressive Synagogue? If it was, do you know in what circumstances, during services or concerts?
I'm sorry. Can you read it?
Of course. Do you know if Weiss's psalm was performed also in Polish in Warsaw Progressive Synagogue? If it was, do you know in what circumstances, during services or concerts?
So there are indications that Weiss's music was performed in the synagogue. If it was performed in Polish, I suspect there were special occasions that were some of them were political occasions also, celebrating a particular national event, patriotic event, or a visit of the Tsar, something like this. So there were reasons to also use secular music. I also know secular music, music in more secular occasions that would particularly necessitate the use of Polish language. That's what I wanted to say. I also know that there were compositions by Gentile composers performed in the synagogue. I have come across a mention specifically by a work of Dobrzyński that was written for the synagogue. I don't know which of the Dobrzyńskis it was because there were several in the family. But yeah, so, but that's, that's the kind of practice that we see elsewhere. For example, in Vienna, when Schubert writes for Solomon Zeltzer's collection.
Another of our viewers, Mr. Jeremiah Lockwood, asked the question I'm going to go back to just before you began the section dedicated to the music of the synagogue. So this maybe sounds a bit general, but I think we can maybe dwell deeper into this part. And I have a follow-up question. So Mr. Lockwood wrote, would you please say something more about the connection between urban Polish Jews in the classical music scene and the emerging world of modern cantoral music in Poland in the period under discussion? So then the question was asked just before you began this section, but I would like to know, maybe this is somehow paraphrasing this question. You began with the section about Jewish musicians or Jewish scholars actually studying in the conservatory and then writing for the synagogue, if I got it right. So do we know anything about this precisely this intersection between the teachers, the curriculum at the academy, and then writing the music for the synagogue? Was it?
So the people whose music I have come across did not study in Warsaw. I believe Birnbaum might have studied in Wrocław, which had a cantorial school going back to the 19th century. And it's not entirely clear where Weiss studied. He claimed to have been a student of Sulzer, but that would be the right thing to claim if you wanted to sell your music, which is that's where he makes that claim. So there's perhaps more research that needs to be done about this. The people that I listed on that slide, they were not, they were singers. And at least two of them were choir directors, so it's not inconceivable that they would also make arrangements for the chorus, and they were conservatory trained, the ones that I listed in there. There are also plenty of mentions of concerts of secular music by synagogue musicians. The most famous case is Straszyński, the musician who has been immortalized in the movie The Wilner Balabezel, but that's not who he was really. The whole story of that movie is more complicated. There was actually a historical person, Straszyński, did perform in Warsaw in the early 1840s. And he sang both in the synagogue, but he also performed concerts, and the concerts were reviewed in the press. And then, of course, there is the Arnstein story, Pieśniarze, on which the movie was based, that invents a fictional character that is inspired by Straszyński, but he does not name him Straszyński, and then the name is kind of reused in the movie, and that's why we think of Straszyński as this fictitious figure rather than the historical person. But the historical person already in the 1840s bridged the two realms.
Mm-hmm. And in your presentation, you have focused on, let's say, institutionalized music. By institution, I mean also the salon, like those of Cronenberg. Do we have the information about actually music on the streets and this shared soundscapes of that time? I'm just a music curator / organizer, so I have to Google the thing that it was just in late 1820s that the first Polish Yiddish dictionary was produced. So I'm trying to imagine the streets and actually the mixture of the language and the songs and the music that could be presented there. If you could just draw a picture, it can be based in Łódź, if you prefer.
So here's the problem. Of course, that music was not written down. Mm-hmm. So where we start to have a true treasury of this music is when the recording technology is available. And I think we still need to go carefully through the records that Syrena produced, some of them in the archives of the Warsaw, of the National Library in Warsaw, some of them some of the private collectors have done an amazing job pulling together recordings that exist from the early 20th century. That's where we will get the sound that is likely to happen at weddings and at Jewish celebrations and so forth and so on. We do have some traces of it in one way or another, but we have to be very careful with those traces. For example, the Polish ethnographer Kolberg, and I'm saying ethnographer because we think, when we think about ethnography, we think about kind of more rigorous scientific process of recording carefully, recording music and so forth. And the way Kolberg collected music starting in the 1840s is much more loosely, the process is treated much more loosely. Kolberg has some music in his 27 or so volumes of Lud that he labels Jewish. But again, we have to be very, very careful because very often I think what he has is tunes performed by Gentiles to represent Jewish characters. So that, it's a complicated source. So I think, I think that there are also other folkloristic sources that we may still be able to dig up. I think we can still go back to, early 20th century expeditions such as Anski expedition and see what we can get from that. But I think the problem is we don't know because the music was not notated. Where the music was notated was popular music that was performed for mixed audiences. And the composers that I did not talk at all about are Adolf Sonnenfeld and Leopold Lewandowski, both of them Jewish composers who became very important mainstream composers of dance music, so music for gardens, music, operetta-like performances. And this is popular music, but it's popular music that is not seeking to retain Jewish flavor. It's, you get waltzes, you get czardas, you get polkas. This is the kind of music they're composing.
I would love to follow up and especially kind of go to the area of, I guess, our mutual friend Andrzej Bieńkowski and his research on this particular field. But even better for the discussion, we received lots of questions, and I would like to address them first. I will go back to because there's a comment in a specific tone, a few words about Mieczysław Weinberg, please. But I think we maybe can go to Weinberg at the very end, because I think that somehow he kind of draws on this world you've painted for us in the 19th century. It would be impossible to imagine his music and his versions, his ways of addressing Jewish themes, if not for all those parts you've mentioned earlier. So I will go to another question now. As I understand, the Jewish musicians were well accepted in the Polish Gentile musician milieu during the 19th century. Could you tell us something more about the biography of Wieniawski brothers?
Well, the Wieniawski brothers actually, so as children, because they were so talented, and also because this was the time where musical education in Warsaw was faltering. They were born in Lublin, but the conservatory for a while was closed before it reopened as the institute. So the parents were immediately required to seek musical education outside of Poland. So they went to Paris. They studied the Parisian conservatory, and they remained connected both to Paris and to Brussels. And Henry Wieniawski taught at Brussels for many years and was mostly abroad. Józef spent many years in Warsaw. He also was for some periods of time in Russia, and then ended up. He also did some work in Brussels, I believe, and then he passed away in Brussels as well. Henrik had a really illustrious career. There were European tours. There were also, I think, 2 American tours as well. So.
And could you please tell us something about those soundscapes in which the collaboration or the shared soundscape didn't work that great in this period?
So I alluded to the decrees that we get throughout the 16th, 17th century that are forbidding Jewish musicians from performing under specific circumstances or performing in Gentile spaces. And what we basically get is the guilds competing with each other for the areas of performance that would protect their income. That is the main thing. So yes, there were restrictions, and I think we need to be aware of these restrictions. In the period that I am discussing, perhaps and the area that I'm discussing, perhaps the most public explosion in the area of art music was the so-called Jewish War of 1859. By the 1850s, Jewish patronage of music became very prominent. Not only were Jewish musicians present on Warsaw's musical scene, and not only were patrons supporting musical institutions of Warsaw, but also Jews made up a substantial part of concert-going audiences. There was a concert in 1858 in December a performance by the Neruda sisters. They were part of another musical family, Bohemian family, and they were referred to as the Slavic pride, very much endorsed by Slav countries as great musicians touring Europe, very successful. They performed in Warsaw, and not enough Jewish audience turned up for the concert. And the review that appeared in the press the following day by Josef Koenig was an attack on the Jewish intelligentsia, that they are promoting their own, that they did not come to the concert because of hostility towards Gentile musicians, and on and on. And that would have been just one salvo in a war, would it not be picked up as a larger debate that resonated not just in Warsaw press, but even beyond Polish borders, or Polish borders in other countries, and spilled to kind of a broader discussion of the presence of integrated, assimilated Jews in various aspects of Polish life, whether it was banking, whether it was sciences, whether it was the humanities or music. And it just became that concert became a source of this public debate between members of Jewish intelligentsia, some of the names that I already mentioned in my talk. Gentile supporters of Jewish integration, and the attackers, the people who thought that this is detrimental to Polish economic, intellectual, cultural, musical life. So that was one instance. I am not getting, and that's one of the reasons I have not spoken about interwar musicians. That's just, as you saw, an hour was barely enough to scratch the surface of the 19th century. I'm not getting into the interwar period, but after the death of Piłsudski, these collaborations between musicians have started to suffer, and between Gentile and Jewish music societies and joint concert initiatives. The climate in Poland has changed, gradually gotten worse throughout the 1930s. So,
one of the first questions we actually received is, I think, proper one to maybe end up with. Could you please recommend any compilations of recorded Polish Jewish music available today? Can you find modern music which was influenced by Polish Jewish music, whether in Israel or elsewhere? And of course, this is a gigantic, few blocks of shelves of music. But
you know what?
Again, maybe focusing on the 19th century, where to look for such music?
Okay, so what I would say is, I don't think we have compilations. I don't think anybody has done it. So I suggest, Mr. Prokhorov, that you and I collaborate together, and Pauline puts out a CD like this, because I don't think there's, a lot of the pieces that you heard today have not been performed since their time. Individual composers have received attention. So, for example, Wolfson's Yasha Nemtsov, who is fantastic, he has brought to life many important composers, especially associated with the St. Petersburg Society and Jewish Folk Music Society. And so there's a whole recording of Wolfson's music. It's beautiful, musically beautiful, wonderful performance. So I would suggest, for music like this, Yasha Nemtsov. The recordings of the two choral pieces for the synagogue, nobody has performed this music from these volumes, as far as I know, since 19th or early 20th century. So, and I certainly don't know any compilations of that music. So I asked the director of the wonderful Rutgers Music Department Choir to perform these two pieces for a conference that I participated, that I co-organized a couple of years ago at Rutgers. And he performed these two works quite beautifully. So I have a recording of it, but they are not recorded otherwise. Szymanowska's music has been recorded. The Chopin Institute has released a wonderful recording by Tobias Koch recently, who is a terrific pianist and playing on period pianos, music of Szymanowska and her other contemporaries. But they are, you will find that. So no, there is no compilation of this sort, and it's a project for us to turn to at some point.
I think that our audience is really great, because when I suggested that this will be the last question, we got even more and more coming. So here's one for you. Were there any Lieder in Yiddish apart from the Laza Weiner ones much later?
I'm sorry, what?
Lieder in Yiddish apart from the Laza Weiner ones much later.
So the Lieder in Yiddish, again, you will find them in the ethnographic collections that we have from the early part of the century. And then occasionally we find like the volume from which I took the Five Wishes arrangement. All of those are, this is from Vilna. And as you know, Vilna intelligentsia propagated the Yiddish language as the language of art music, of the language of educated and enlightened Jews. So the chorus there was looking for arrangements of Yiddish songs, and that compilation just came out just before World War II, early in 1939. But these are older arrangements; they are not necessarily from 1939. So yes, I mean there's still material that needs to be dug up, and there's work for people like me, musicologists, to go looking for these things. Somebody like Abraham Birnbaum, he was such a fascinating figure, and his writings about liturgical music. He was very interested in education, cantorial education, and so forth. So there is work for a scholar to sit down and go through what we have from him and learn more about both what was happening in Częstochowa. But he actually was educated in Łódź, and then he returned to Łódź after he retired. So this is clearly these places were not islands. They were connected to each other. Material traveled from one place to another.
And if we can go back to Weinberg to somehow answer the question of one of our viewers on mentioning him, and if I may elaborate on that a bit more, because I think that many of listeners that come into the world of Jewish music enter them with the contemporary interpretation of klezmer music, post-klezmer music, whatever we call it. And then we go backwards and backwards and backwards. And for me, it was very interesting that it was just the second half of the 19th century where the folk music enters the world of composed music. So I guess it was absent before. And when we think Jewish music, we think of it very much as based and rooted in folk music. So then coming back to Weinberg, it seems that he's one of the, maybe not pioneers, but still the first top 10 chronologically musicians, composers that actually write music so very much inspired by the Jewish folklore. Is that correct? And if not, where to seek for the sources of Jewish folk music in the classical, let's call it, or the concert music?
So, of course, this is the difference. If you think about what, first of all, let me explain why I didn't talk about Weinberg. Weinberg is a whole lecture to himself, and I will be glad to come back in the future and talk about interwar period and about Weinberg's music is stunning. last month I listened to the cello concerto and I couldn't stop. I just had it on repeat. It's stunning, and it's one of those pieces that incorporates the Yiddish tunes in it. So I think what one needs to understand is that you have a shift between the thinking of the integrationists, which is through Haskalah, through Bildung, we seek the common European art tradition for the self-cultivation, for the self-elevation. And that's one viewpoint. Then there are two other viewpoints that become very prominent. The folkist viewpoint, which is not necessarily connected to Zionism, but is endorsing a very specific Jewish identity locally in Poland, and the Zionist musical perspective, which is seeking to create a language that is not just Jewish inspired, but also Jewish inspired for cultivation of a national identity in the future state of Israel. And that's when you start having these kind of ventures into the folklore as a source of inspiration. That is not to say that folklore did not exist, but it did not before that. Of course, it existed. Of course, in traditional Jewish settings, that's what was performed, what was played. But that is when it becomes an object of interest of educated and otherwise progressive Jews, people who see themselves as pursuing a kind of a musical art tradition, but seeking inspiration through folklore. And with that in mind, I think in Poland, the first generation of that, it actually comes just around World War I. And I would say that the one who is earlier than Weinberg is Wolfson. Generationally, Wolfson is already composing in the late 19 teens, and in the 20s, Weinberg comes of age just on the eve of World War II. So Weinberg is the kind of second generation. I would also suggest that you explore some of the music of Rathaus. Especially, he wrote music for the theater, again associated with the St. Petersburg Society, Habima, for the Berlin performance of Uriel Acosta. And he very deliberately, it's music for a play. So it's kind of like a film underscore. So it's Baroque-like because it's supposed to move us to Baroque period, which is the time of Uriel Acosta, but also it as the Jewish, the Hasidic element kind of becomes important in the play, he bursts into a beautiful adaptation of Hasidic music for an orchestra. There is a stunning performance you will easily find on YouTube by Joan Falletta, with Joan Falletta conducting. It's stunning. As one of my friends said, she drives the orchestra like a Lamborghini. So enjoy it. It's a great performance.
Unfortunately, we ran out of time. Madam Professor, thank you so much for this great and super interesting presentation. And as you said, we could go in so many different areas and discuss it for hours, because each of this section is of course much more than 1 hour lecture. It's like volumes of music and books and everything. And it was a great pleasure and honor to have you as our guest, as our speaker for the first lecture of the Distinguished Lecture Series in 2021. And I'm happy to say that the lecture is organized as a part of the Global Education Outreach Program that was made possible thanks to Toby Philanthropies, the William K. Bowes Jr. Foundation, and the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. Madam Professor, thank you so very much. And for our dear audience, thank you for showing up and for all the great questions. And you might be interested that, in fact, that the next lecture will take place in November the 14th. So mark it down in your calendar. This lecture will be by Professor Don Seaman from the Emory University, and the lecture will be devoted to the legacy of Polish Jews in religion, and will be delivered on November 14th, 2021. We also invite you to the GEO online events accompanying the exhibition, the upcoming exhibition at Polin Museum, Wilhelm Sasnal, Such a Landscape. The program will include, again, autumn activities in September, a discussion on the lasting impact on Holocaust landscapes, in October, a debate on the difficult past and art, and in November, a lecture on Wilhelm Sasnal's abstract painting. So please follow us on Facebook and probably put your email down for our newsletter on the GEO program. Madam Professor, once again, thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen. Professor Halina Goldberg.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.